So at 𝐸𝐴N 2022, there were some arguments for better representation of local and indigenous languages and cultural diversity in research management and South African conservation discourse more generally. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I think my presentation can be seen as a bit of a pushback against some of the attitudes and the microaggressions that I've encountered locally at the spa, on Sedgefield Local's Facebook page. There's a lot of kind of tension underlying a lot of the social divisions in the Garden Route area, and I'm a little bit worried about what that means for transformation more generally. So last year I realized that 𝐸𝐴N attendees are also very much under pressure to wear a million hats, to be brilliant communicators, innovators, doing excellent research, balancing livelihoods with biodiversity. So there's a lot that we need to do, but I don't think that that means that we can at all take issues of heritage, culture, and language off the table. I think that the two things that we need to keep in mind is that spaces need to be demographically diverse, that change needs to happen. There's basically Black, African, and women researchers are underrepresented among authors of field studies. There's many studies that are talking about this. And then also that those in these spaces need to be open-minded about transformation and willing and able to reevaluate their own assumptions and precepts, including mindsets towards language and culture. An example of this was, I'm sure some people saw this article in 2020, from Merlin Nomusa-Nkomo, a conservation biologist and ornithologist. And she said, most conservationists do not even bother to learn local languages or pronounce things right. And they assume their surveys with people of a different language and culture are not on a superficial level. Almost all Black folks in conservation identify as science communicators because we have to double up for this role and educate our community the way we know works. Like Patisa Nyati once said to an audience at a vulture talk, keep frowning on African culture and your birds will be driven extinct by what you call myths and superstitions. Beliefs are as real as their consequences. And I think there's been a lot of examples in the previous presentations that speak to this. So respect for language, and here I'm talking about word choice, gesture, pronunciation, is a matter of respect for the communities that we work in and with. Let me just see. For creating heterogeneous and equitable cultural environments at work. So it's not just about how we go out into the field, it's also what it feels like to be in our offices. And it's also a matter of ensuring scientific accuracy. So as Tali Palmer shared at 𝐸𝐴N last year, assumptions may be made in research contexts due to the language in which data is gathered or discussed because of the researcher's assumptions or cultural bias. And these affect both the flow of the research and the findings. In addition, it's important that research that is conducted in indigenous languages includes the findings for keywords in those languages, so the translations are not misrepresentative. And the importance of this became clear in discussions the other day with Fraser Vitu, Benjamin Mosekiwa, and Prof. 𝐸𝐴𝐻𝐶𝐶, as we spoke about the English connotations of killing as opposed to hunting or poaching, and discussed whether the Shona word kuvima used by respondents connoted all three. So while the temptation is to translate everything into English because the lingua franca at 𝐸𝐴N is English, it's better to at least include the original wording as Fraser and Louise did in their presentations, so that the same words may be used in research with similar communities. As Prof. 𝐸𝐴𝐻𝐶𝐶 pointed out, there are also hints about moral value, mannerisms, and behavior that are contained in these words. For example, the word for shaking the tree to harvest the fruit in Fraser's presentation has negative connotations of recklessness. So this is important for interdisciplinary work, because if a linguist were to look at the findings of such a study, they would actually find the study scientifically incorrect if the original terms were not included. Also, should communities wish to use the research product, it may help to use the wording that's common or familiar in those original languages. I'm sure that this is something that's familiar to many people. We also need to question preconceived notions about language and its links with identity, ethnicity, or nationhood. If we're going to be truly critical of work that has to do with others in any context, it's good to openly discuss the discussion before we do anything else. In South Africa, there's still shame, fear, and frustration that comes with this terrain. As a colleague said, this topic terrifies them, and they'd much rather go off and count animals than discuss this. And I also am reading today because I get so terrified that quite often the words go right out of my head when I'm talking about something like this. So what I share today comes from my perspective as a so-called white, English-speaking South African with limitations in the amount of language I currently speak, the precepts I've grown up with, and the communities I have and have not circulated in. Through my learning and teaching at university, I came to better understand whiteness. I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar with whiteness as a construct, not as a skin color. If anybody's not familiar with whiteness, just give me a puzzled look. Okay, right. And familiarity with what Matt Zylstra called weird contexts last year. So I still have a lot of blind spots, but I'd like to share some things that I found really interesting. And I playfully call this learning to be South African. And I think that all South Africans could do more of this. For example, there may be very few people here who are familiar with Bharatanatyam dance forms, but it's part of our culture. I basically wish that every day was Heritage Day, and that most people knew a lot more about these things than about the British royal family's latest scandal. So part of the practice of learning to be South African is mentally using the word white in scare quotes, because we use terms like white, black, African, colored, and Indian very glibly. I know we have to do this because this is how resources were organized during apartheid, and this needs redress. But what bothers me in terms of heritage is how this reinforces divisions that may not be there. On my journey through learning to be South African, I found that I was related to Anna de Koning, and Olaf Berg. Yes, he of the whiskey bottle. And it basically changed my life, because I had perceived myself as an English-speaking person. I was off the 1820 settlers' boat. And suddenly I had this huge history that went back to the 1600s and slave ancestry. And I want to reassure everybody that this doesn't mean that I think I deserve the land. Although if I did, the land that I would be claiming would be 𝐼𝐴𝐻𝐿𝐴, so, because that's what Anna owned by the end of her life. But what it did do for me is that when I started to travel in public, I would sit on a plane, and I would look around me and I'd think, anybody here could be my kin, because Anna de Koning was a stammoeder of South Africa, whites, not even whites, general South African society. So there's people from across different cultural boundaries. So actually now when I speak to someone, I'm like, you're a brother or a sister, you could be kin. And this was reconfirmed when I told a friend about this very great interest that I had, and she was like, I'm also a descendant of Anna de Koning, and she's one of my very best friends. And then I chat to people and they're like, I'm descended from 𝐶𝐴𝐻𝐿𝐴. So there's people all over the show who are kind of aware of this broad heritage. And it's really important for shooting down divisiveness, because I've had students say to me when I'm very English, and they say to me, they get cross with me and they say, well, your people put my people in concentration camps. And I say, no, my people put my people in concentration camps, because there's so many different kinds of ancestries in my tree. So one thing that I do to practice being South African in the car is I ululate, and I practice saying different words, and I basically just sit there and retrain myself. And you can hear now, as I'm speaking, there's so much fear, and it's like a daily practice of overcoming fear. So one of the things that I'm also aware of is that there's unfortunately still a perception among some English first language speakers that good English makes for a finer or classier or more well-bred person. Just the other day I was relicensing my car in Knysna, and a lady commented to the teller, you speak so well, where do you come from? And there was such a loaded kind of assumption behind that. And I know that there are some colleagues in the audience from France and Zimbabwe, Brazil, and the Netherlands who may have slightly different takes on this. But in the academic context that I have been in, the normative use of English is often treated as a given. Many of my students suffered academically at university not through poor critical thinking, but poor expression of critical thinking in English. I attempted to change my teaching practice, drawing the politics of language into the spotlight by encouraging students to respond to learning material in languages of their choice. We discussed responses in Tshivenda, Tsotsitaal, isiXhosa, Zulu, Afrikaans, Francois, or code switching between two languages. In one case, a student wrote an entire essay in 𝐶𝑉𝑡songa, and it took me 2 days to translate it. Talking about language in my classes improved the flow of communication. It eased tension and created trust. Some students aired and deconstructed the social stigmas to do with language, such as fearing judgment for talking with accented English, and the power differentials across sociolinguistic groups, including within 𝐶INTU groups. And there were comments from many students who had never commented before. So it opened up these avenues for a lot of people, maybe that they were also suffering fear and shame. And my subsequent PhD research into the representation of student knowledges in higher education made me question this notion of inclusivity. And I'll just switch here to an interesting thing that Mail and Guardian did to stop italicizing words and phrases in South African languages. Just basically talking about a different way of thinking about what is our language, there is no our and there in this context. So, long research story short, I ended up arguing that there was great potential for expanding the vocabulary of art and design theory in South Africa and deconstructing the canonical and linguistic histories of terms such as art, design, and architecture, and positioning this as core knowledge in the field. And I think that the same is actually true for sociological research spaces, and that there could be, like a whole, I don't know if there already is, somebody must educate me, a whole section of the field to do with this. How many, I think that probably, I have got a few slides, which I'm probably not going to get into. As I said, I knew that my slide was too long. My presentation was too long, but I think that one thing I want to talk about is just how the 12 official languages sort of make many South Africans feel quite proud, like there's so much representation, but there's actually so many languages that are excluded in that process. Something that I didn't know when I started out was that many languages that are standardized today as main languages are actually created or at least standardized during missionary and colonial presence. And that also that there's so much intelligibility across different language forms. And as a white South African, I had a huge block to learning indigenous languages. I learned Zulu at school, but I had this perception that I was only learning Zulu. And then as I studied more, I realized that there's actually this kind of world that opens up if you have an awareness of language. So this is some examples of different spelling that was introduced, that was standardized by missionaries, and it's still applicable today. I did think of Victor when I put that slide in. And I think that there's also something that happens when we claim that a language is related to an ethnicity, and we stand by that language and we defend that language. There's also life worlds that are present in language. So these things give us a view of the world. I'm going to just skip forward. This is why I read, sorry guys, because I do get lost. I just wanted to say that there are places in many contexts in academia where different language from other contexts is being drawn into academia to represent contexts that have no equivalency in English. 𝐍𝐞𝐭𝐰𝐨𝐫𝐤𝐢𝐧𝑠 is somebody who's doing this in a local context. And lastly, I'll just end off with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is that the particular language that one speaks influences the way one thinks about reality. So that patterns of language use in cultural contexts can affect thought. And I think that this is important when we start to talk about language, like things in this context, as nature is supplying a range of services. Water is a commodity. We talk about wildlife management and even a green prescription, because these are things that are using the language of the economy that we all feel bound to use. And then because I knew I was going to struggle with this, I'm going to finish with a lovely excerpt from 𝐈𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐫𝐼𝐍, who is a Nigerian Yoruba activist, more philosopher, but I see him a lot in environmental spaces, somebody who speaks about the relationship between humans and animals, and how he speaks so beautifully about his learning Tamil, his wife's language. So it's not an easy tongue to convene or to master. When my wife EJ speaks it, the language sounds to me like they're crushed up words, words ground finely into a smooth, buttery admixture, vigorously stirred in a generous head wobble, and then applied like turmeric paste on the ears of the listener, with musical accompaniment. Unlike English and its clunky, anxious boundaries, Tamil flows like an unchecked masala stream. After many failures, I gave up on trying to learn it until our 8-year-old daughter Alethea started to understand it and speak it, mocking my bovine imperviousness to her mother's language. I made a firm decision then that I was once again going to try to do the thing that I seemed quite incapable of doing, learning a new language. Some days ago, while meeting with children in our neighborhood, distributing food in the name of our son, EJ taught me the words to say as I approached proper strangers. I said them to myself studiously, over and over again, repeating it so that it stuck. Say it with a wobble, EJ added, as her own head swiveled like a pendulum. But I shall look foolish if I try that, my mind protested. With something in my throat, I tried it out anyway. Meeting a stranger with the words EJ loaned me, and then unleashing my secret weapon, the reassurance of a imperfectly curated head wobble. Through their face masks, I knew the people I met were smiling, touched in a way. It wasn't the words I said, it was a part of the language that's largely unspoken. Something about the gesture brought me to my knees, exposed me, opened my animal paws a bit wider, just wide enough to allow the sinewy threads of mutuality to interrupt my isolation. And I'll skip to the end. I have a strong suspicion that even if we mastered all the words, we wouldn't be close to speaking, at least not in the performatively socio-material ways I frame voice. It will take a becoming animal, a loosening of the spine, a stretching of the paws, a relaxing of the edges, a tenderization of meaning, and a post-humanist surrendering of some kind for new languages to take root. It will take a head wobble. So what I'll finish off just saying, language is something that we need to throw our bodies into. And it was something I wasn't able to do today in this presentation. There's too much fear holding me back. But I strive to have one day just be able to throw myself into this. Thank you.